Welcome to the second meeting of our studies in language planning and policies in education. Today, we'll be looking at approaches that have to be taken in language planning and policies in education, and we are going to consider 4 of these. The first one is that we should consider the policy formulation and the policy implementation as an approach. In this one, we have to consider the distinctions between the formulation of a policy and implementation of a policy in terms of which one begins and why should it begin. Now, there is a distinction between a policy formulation, that is about decision making, and policy implementation. It is important to consider which one should come first. Procedurally, that is, policy formulation should begin before policy implementation, because it is expected to level the ground for implementation. And in leveling this ground for implementation, it will take into account and include the following. 1. Considering the materials needed for effective implementation of the policy. In the consideration of materials, especially in education, you would take into account materials like textbooks, infrastructure in terms of classrooms, human resource availability, technological equipment, and many more. At infrastructural level, there is need to consider whether there are adequate buildings and there is adequate networking for people's mobility. And this includes road network, so that people can move from one institution to another institution in terms of their work coordination. Further, an example may be drawn from Malawi, which has done so well in policy formulation, very good at policy pronunciation, but not good in implementation. Let me draw you to a specific example. The specific example I am drawing you to is actually the mother tongue policy, the mother tongue education policy. Now, if you look at the mother tongue education policy, you will see that it had and faced a number of challenges. When implementing this policy, one would have to consider what were the challenges of the policy in consideration of materials, teachers training, teachers deployment, teachers transfers, linguistic and ethnic limitations, and promoting nationalization and the unity of Malawians. These are very, very important. So, what should come first? Policy implementation or policy pronunciation? Is there any need to clear the ground first before implementation? As the case has appeared from the example above that I have given you earlier on, it's important to realize the fact that there is need to make a decision in terms of policy making. So you formulate the policy and you begin to make decisions as to what the policy will demand. That is going to make you prepare the ground properly before it can actually be implemented. As the case is for Malawi, the policy of mother tongue education, it was thought out quickly. Decisions were reached, but the ground was not properly prepared for the implementation of the policy. Hence, the policy had challenges in terms of the materials, that's the resources, teachers training, teachers transfers, teachers deployment, and also linguistic limitations. All these came in as challenges just because the policy was quickly decided upon, and before any planning was done on the ground, the policy was already implemented. So that is the challenge that is there. And this is therefore typically telling us and informing us very well that in any case, we have to start with policy making so that we predetermine how to level the ground for its implementation. That's very, very important. The second approach in language planning is by policy function approach. What does this entail? The other distinction to bear in mind in policy approach, in this case, is selection of national or official language and what solutions you bring or you arrive at in grammar and orthography rules. You also consider which languages will be for education. There are cases where language for education may be different from the national language, and this is possible. And this means, therefore, that before you think about any policy in education, you tie it to function. Then you can make policies that can make sense in the society. Because there should be no policy that should just be made without focusing on the functions and the purposes. This is also very, very important. Now, the other approach is the cultivation approach. This is another approach in language planning policies where by cultivation you mean you have to plan and develop strategies that are going to help you run or manage the policy. And so you need to consider cultivation approach, and this in particular looks at style and rules governing stylistic rules of the language. Basically, it looks at graphization, that is, reducing language into writing system, and establishing the spelling system of the language. You also look at the standardization of the language, so that everything that comes into the language is of high standard. They meet the standards, the requirements for which a language will be well known. Thus, accepting one variety of language to be used in school and give it the rules and regulations